One cruel teacher, one mysterious notebook, and a quiet student's secret. What started as humiliation ended in a lesson no one saw coming. The last row of room 302 had become Oliver Adams' perfect refuge. It was there, surrounded by empty desks and protected by the shadow of the last light fixtures, that he felt safest. At 15, he had learned that invisibility had its advantages, especially when you're the popular kid's favorite target. His brown eyes, always downcast, observed the world through bangs that served as a protective curtain, while his fingers nervously played with the worn edges of his notebook. Laughter echoed through the hallway every time he passed, carrying his worn backpack and clothes that seemed to have known better times. "Hey, weirdo," the football team boys would shout. "Why don't you disappear for good?" The words cut like knives, but Oliver had developed a special ability to pretend he didn't hear them. His face remained impassive, a mask so well practiced that even the teachers believed he really didn't care about anything around him. During breaks, while other students formed animated groups in the courtyard, Oliver found peace in the empty library. Sitting at a secluded table, he spent hours bent over his notebook, making notes that no one ever saw. His eyes gained a different shine in these moments, as if he were immersed in a private world that no one else could access. The librarian, Mr. Thompson, sometimes observed him with curiosity, intrigued by the lonely boy's dedication. In class, Oliver was just another number in roll call, a silent presence that teachers barely noticed. His grades were average, enough not to draw attention, neither positive nor negative. When group assignments were announced, he already knew his fate. He would be the last to be chosen, if chosen at all. Most times he ended up doing assignments alone, something he secretly preferred, though he'd never admit it aloud. Teachers interpreted his isolation as shyness or lack of interest. The only time Oliver showed any emotion was when he opened his worn notebook. His hands, normally trembling, became steady when turning each page. Between the faded blue lines, something seemed to come alive, something he protected with absolute zeal from curious eyes. When someone approached, he quickly closed the notebook, as if guarding a forbidden treasure. And perhaps he did, for his eyes revealed a different sparkle in these moments, a sparkle that suggested there was much more to this quiet boy than anyone could imagine. On that rainy October afternoon, as the day's last light crept through the foggy windows of room 302, no one could predict that Oliver's silence was about to tell a story that would change everything, and everyone. The classroom chatter ceased instantly when Mrs. Harrison crossed the doorway. Her high heels marked an intimidating rhythm against the ceramic floor, echoing like a metronome announcing changes. Her gray hair, tied in a severe bun, perfectly matched her impeccable gray suit and thin-framed glasses that seemed to dissect each student present. As a substitute advanced mathematics teacher, she had already built a frightening reputation in just 2 weeks of class. "Mediocrity," she pronounced the word slowly, while her eyes scanned the room, "is a disease that spreads when we allow weak students to contaminate others with their lack of ambition." Her voice had a cutting tone that made students shrink in their seats. Mrs. Harrison had a special talent for identifying insecurities, and her teaching method seemed based on exposing them publicly. She firmly believed that humiliation was an effective learning tool. The day's first victim was Sarah Collins, a shy girl in the 3rd row. "Miss Collins," Mrs. Harrison's voice dripped with disdain, "perhaps you can explain why you waste everyone's time with such inadequate answers." The tears in Sarah's eyes were visible as she tried to explain her solution to a particularly complex problem. The teacher didn't wait for her to finish, interrupting her with an exaggerated sigh of disapproval that provoked nervous laughter from some students. The atmosphere in the room grew denser with each passing minute. Students avoided eye contact, fearing to be the next chosen for the lesson of the day, as Mrs. Harrison called her public humiliation exercises. She seemed to take special pleasure in choosing the quietest students, those she considered lost causes. Her gaze frequently wandered to the back of the room, where the shadows seemed denser, as if searching for her next prey. The tension reached its peak when Mrs. Harrison began walking between the rows, her heels marking each step like a countdown to her next victim. She stopped occasionally, examining notebooks and making biting comments about students' handwriting or organization. The closer she got to the back of the room, the heavier the silence became. But not even Mrs. Harrison, with all her experience in identifying and exposing weaknesses, could imagine that she was about to awaken something that would completely change the power balance in her classroom. The days following Mrs. Harrison's arrival transformed the school hallways into a minefield of anxiety. Students walked pressed against the walls, whispering about who would be the next victim of her educational sessions. Even the most confident students began questioning their abilities, dreading the moment they would be exposed in front of the class. Fear had become so palpable that some began skipping classes, preferring to face the consequences of absence rather than face the teacher's icy stare. Jason Wright, the basketball team captain, was the first of the popular kids to fall. Known for his unshakable confidence, he was reduced to stuttering and cold sweats when Mrs. Harrison forced him to solve an equation in front of the class. "I see your ability with numbers is as impressive as your capacity to intimidate the weak," she commented with a cruel smile, while Jason struggled with the trembling chalk. The boy who used to mock others was now tasting the bitter flavor of public humiliation. During break, something unusual happened. Emily Chen, one of the class's best students, was silently sobbing in the library after being ridiculed for an elementary mistake, as Mrs. Harrison had classified it. To the surprise of all who witnessed the scene, it was Oliver who discreetly slid a piece of paper in her direction. On the paper was a clear and detailed explanation of the problem she had gotten wrong, written in a way that made the concept seem surprisingly simple. Emily looked back, but Oliver had already disappeared between the shelves. News of the small act of kindness spread quickly, though in whispers. Students began noticing that the quiet boy in the last row seemed to have a peculiar understanding of the subject, even though he never participated in class. Some swore they had seen him solving complex problems in his mysterious notebook, while others insisted they had caught him helping other struggling students, always discreetly and fleetingly. It was as if he existed in the classroom's shadows, an almost ghostly presence that appeared only to offer help before vanishing again. Mrs. Harrison, however, seemed increasingly obsessed with Oliver's reserved behavior. Her eyes narrowed dangerously whenever she observed him scribbling in his notebook, as if she knew there was something unusual about this seemingly mediocre student. During her classes, she began circling more frequently near the last row, her high heels echoing like a sinister warning. The air became electrically charged every time she approached Oliver, who remained motionless, like prey trying to go unnoticed before a predator. While tension grew each day, no one suspected that the real test wouldn't be about mathematics, but about courage, and that the quietest boy in class was about to give the loudest lesson of all. A particularly tense atmosphere hung in room 302 that autumn morning. Mrs. Harrison had arrived earlier than usual, and her contained smile carried a silent threat that made students fidget uneasily in their seats. She began the class with studied calmness, writing on the board a series of equations that seemed to grow progressively more complex. Her long fingers held the chalk with almost surgical precision, and the sound of writing on the board was the only noise heard in the room. "Today," she announced, turning to face the class with a predatory gleam in her eyes, "we will test the limits of what you call knowledge." Her voice had an almost melodious tone, but carried a veiled threat that made several students swallow hard. One by one, she began calling students to solve problems on the board, each exercise more challenging than the last. With each failed attempt, her comments became sharper, more personal, dissecting not just the mathematical errors, but also each student's insecurities. Panic spread like a silent wave through the room as the best students were taken down one by one. Even those who normally excelled in mathematics found themselves paralyzed before the presented problems. Mrs. Harrison seemed to extract particular pleasure from each drop of sweat, each trembling hand, each look of defeat. It was as if she was methodically building a monument to collective failure, brick by brick, humiliation, by humiliation. It was then that her gaze fixed on the last row, where Oliver remained absorbed in his notebook, apparently oblivious to the drama unfolding. "Mr. Adams," her voice cut through the air like a razor, "perhaps you can grace us with your wisdom." The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to the back of the room, where Oliver slowly raised his head from his notebook. For the first time, students noticed something different in his gaze. There was no fear, only a contained intensity that no one had noticed before. Oliver stood up slowly, his deliberately calm movements contrasting with the palpable tension in the air. Mrs. Harrison walked to the board and erased all previous equations with abrupt movements. In their place, she wrote a single differential equation so complex it made several students gasp. "This problem," she announced with a cruel smile, "defeated even my best students last semester. But surely you, always so absorbed in your precious scribbles at the back of the room, will show us how a true genius solves this. After all, there must be something very special in that worn little notebook of yours to deserve more attention than my class, isn't there, Mr. Adams?" What happened in the next few minutes would not only change the course of that class, but would reveal that sometimes silence can hide the most extraordinary truths. A dense silence took over the room as Oliver walked toward the board. His slow and measured steps echoed on the floor, each one marking the distance between his old protection in the last row and the merciless exposure at the front of the room. Some students looked away, unable to watch another public massacre orchestrated by Mrs. Harrison. Others, however, couldn't take their eyes off the unfolding scene, hypnotized by the unusual calmness of the boy who had always gone unnoticed. The chalk trembled slightly in Oliver's fingers when he picked it up, leaving a small white cloud in the air. For the first time, the entire class could see his face without the protection of his bangs. There was something in his eyes, a strange and intense gleam that no one recognized. Mrs. Harrison crossed her arms, her mocking smile frozen as she watched the boy examine the complex equation on the board. The sound of the wall clock seemed thunderous in the sepulchral silence that dominated the room. Then, something extraordinary began to happen. Oliver's hand, previously hesitant, gained firmness. His movements became fluid and precise as he began to write, line after line of calculations appearing on the board like a mathematical dance. They weren't just numbers and symbols. There was an elegance to the solutions, a clarity that made the most complex problems seem almost simple. Mrs. Harrison's smile began to falter, her eyebrows furrowing in a mixture of confusion and growing concern. The other students began leaning forward in their desks, fascinated. Even those who normally slept during math classes were now completely absorbed. Sarah Collins, still with eyes red from crying, was the first to notice. Oliver wasn't just solving the problem. He was using methods that went far beyond the school curriculum. His notes filled the board in an impeccable logical sequence that made the solution seem obvious, as if he were telling a story through numbers. Mrs. Harrison stepped forward, her high heel breaking the reverent silence that had settled in. Her face had lost all color, and her lips moved silently as she followed Oliver's calculations. It was possible to see the exact moment when she realized that something extraordinary was happening right before her eyes. The boy she had chosen to humiliate was demonstrating a mastery of mathematics that she herself would struggle to match. As the last line of calculations took shape on the board, a whisper of admiration ran through the room. But what Oliver would do next would leave even Mrs. Harrison speechless. In a surprising movement, Oliver lowered the chalk and turned to face the class. His posture had subtly changed. The previously hunched shoulders were now straight, and his typically evasive gaze was firm and direct. The transformation was so remarkable that some students shifted in their seats, as if they were seeing a completely different person. Mrs. Harrison, still pale, frantically examined the equations on the board, her eyes jumping from one line to another in search of some error she could use to regain control of the situation. Actually, Oliver's voice sounded clear and controlled, breaking years of self-imposed silence. There are 3 possible solutions to this equation. The murmur of surprise that ran through the room was instantaneous. It wasn't just the fact that he was speaking, it was the confidence with which his words flowed, as if he was finally allowing a long-hidden part of himself to surface. His fingers, previously trembling, now danced across the board as he pointed to different parts of his solution. Mrs. Harrison tried to interrupt him, but her voice came out strangely weak. "Mr. Adams, that's impossible. The equation clearly—" She stopped mid-sentence when Oliver began writing again, this time in a clean section of the board. His movements were even more confident now, like a conductor leading a mathematical symphony. The numbers and symbols flowed from his hand with a naturalness that made it seem like he had been born for this moment. It was during this demonstration that something even more extraordinary happened. Jason Wright, the same boy who used to lead the mockery against Oliver, abruptly stood up from his desk. "Wait a minute," his voice cut through the silence. "That math competition last year, on TV, was that you?" His eyes widened with sudden recognition, and he pulled his phone from his pocket, typing frantically. Mrs. Harrison watched the scene with a mixture of horror and fascination, as if watching her carefully constructed world crumble before her eyes. The smile that began to form on Oliver's lips was different from anything his classmates had ever seen. It wasn't shy or forced, but genuine and serene. It was the smile of someone who finally found their place, of someone who no longer needed to hide. The atmosphere in the room had completely changed. Where there was once fear and tension, now hung a sense of admiration and discovery. As Jason continued his frantic search on his phone, an even greater truth was about to come to light. A truth that would not only change how everyone saw Oliver, but would shake the very foundations of the school hierarchy. The silence in the room was broken by the sound of Jason almost dropping his phone. "Oh my God," he exclaimed, his voice trembling with disbelief. "Oliver Adams. First place in the National Mathematics Olympiad. He defeated university competitors." The words fell like bombs in the classroom, and all eyes turned to Oliver, who remained standing by the board, still holding the chalk with that newly discovered confidence. The murmur of amazement that ran through the room was like a wave, gradually growing in volume and intensity. Mrs. Harrison staggered a few steps back, her face a mask of shock and disbelief. The contrast between her previous arrogance and her current state of perplexity couldn't be more dramatic. "Impossible," she muttered, but her voice lacked its usual authority. Her eyes jumped frantically between the board full of brilliant calculations and the young man who had written them, the same young man she had chosen to publicly humiliate. The hands that previously gestured with such confidence now visibly trembled. Sarah Collins, still with tears in her eyes from previous humiliations, was the first to stand and start applauding. The solitary sound of her clapping was soon joined by another, then another, until the entire room exploded in applause and shouts of admiration. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing not just recognition for Oliver's talent, but also all the pent-up frustration with Mrs. Harrison's regime of terror. Oliver, for the first time, allowed a genuine smile to illuminate his face. Emily Chen, the girl Oliver had discreetly helped in the library, stood up from her desk with her phone in hand. "Here!" she exclaimed, showing the screen to nearby classmates. "He didn't just win the National Olympiad, he set a new record. The newspapers said some of his solutions were so innovative that even the judges had difficulty fully understanding them." The news spread through the room like fire, each new revelation about Oliver's achievements provoking more astonishment and admiration. Mrs. Harrison, who moments before reigned supreme over her domain of fear and intimidation, now seemed extraordinarily small. Her elaborate bun was beginning to unravel, strands of gray hair escaping in all directions, as if even her impeccable hairstyle could no longer maintain the facade of control. She opened her mouth several times to speak, but no sound came out. The power she had exercised through fear and humiliation was dissolving before her eyes, melting like snow under the hot sun of newly revealed truth. But while the room celebrated the revelation of the mathematical prodigy who had hidden among them for so long, no one could imagine that the greatest transformation was still to come, a change that would affect not just that class, but the entire school. In the weeks following Oliver's revelation, a remarkable transformation began to take shape in the school hallways. The boy who was once invisible became a luminous presence, not by seeking the spotlight, but through his newly discovered willingness to share his gift with others. During breaks, the library, previously his solitary refuge, transformed into a lively study center where students from all grades gathered around him, eager to learn. Most surprising was the change in the bullies themselves. Jason Wright, who previously led the mockery against Oliver, became one of his most dedicated students. "It's like he makes math speak our language," Jason explained to his basketball teammates, who now also attended the study sessions. Oliver's humility in teaching, his patience in explaining complex concepts in simple ways, and his genuine joy when someone understood something new made him a natural teacher. Mrs. Harrison didn't return to school after that day. Rumors said she had requested a transfer to another school district, but no one cared much about her fate. Her legacy of fear and intimidation was quickly replaced by something much more powerful: a culture of mutual support and collaborative learning. The new math teacher, an enthusiastic young man named Mr. Martinez, was so impressed with Oliver's study group that he made it an official school program. Oliver's worn notebook, previously his best-kept secret, became a legend in itself. In it, students discovered not just brilliant solutions to complex problems, but also a new way of seeing mathematics as a universal language that could be beautiful and accessible to all. The worn pages contained more than equations. They held the story of a boy who had found refuge in numbers, and now used that same refuge to build bridges between people. The deepest change, however, was in the school's atmosphere itself. The social divisions that once seemed so rigid began to dissolve. It was common to see athletes studying with nerds, popular kids asking questions to shy ones, all united by the desire to learn. Oliver had proved that appearances are deceiving, that a person's true value isn't in their social position or how they present themselves to the world, but in their capacity to make a difference in others' lives. And so, the boy who once sought to become invisible ended up lighting the way for everyone around him. And as the sun set through the library windows that afternoon,